Hello and welcome to another video. So we're taking another look at Portalcraft. It's been a little while since I've covered the deck and I've made a few adjustments to the deck for the current meta that I'm running it in. And it seems to be doing really well. I've lost one game in the last 5, which I think is pretty solid, although one of my games was reasonably close, as you will see in this video. So starting the deck off, we're running, of course, the 2 fabrications. I think 3 is too much and I think 2 is just enough for most decks. It works really nicely with a lot of the 1-drops, especially when you have Acceleradium on board. You can literally get free value out of them, which is really nice. But I think any more and you're going to clutter your hand too much. I am running triple Acceleradium. I was running 2 for one of my previous decks. Bumped it back up to 3, mainly just because the consistency and being able to throw 1 to board and discard 1 is always really nice. So triple Hamlin. I always got to remember I've got animates in this deck. Triple Hamlin works really well, of course, with both artifacts and artifact stuffers, I guess. That's what we'll call them, artifact stuffers, like Icarus and Mecha Wing. Also Lion, which is great. I really enjoy Lion. I don't use it as much as I probably could, but Icarus usually gets most of my attention, as long with Iron Staff Mechanic, both of which are great cards. I do only run 2 Iron Staff Mechanic though, because when you're filling the deck, wards are great, but I found that getting the rush ones are much more important in the current meta. Otherwise, I'd probably mess around with the numbers a bit and mess around with Mecha Wing Swordsman and Iron Staff Mechanic, depending on what kind of meta we're in. If I want more of a ward heavy deck, or whether I want more of just kind of artifact floods. So really interchangeable numbers with those two. Dimensional Cut, I am running 2. Some people would run 3. I think 2 is comfortable, it works well. You get the value out of it just fine. Getting that 4 damage, usually really nice. 2 damage is still fine for removing almost everything in the early game. So that works really well in the current meta as well. Substitution, again, another removal card, especially since it is a banish, which will help remove a lot of problem cards. We're also, of course, running the Mecha Soldier, 3 of. Why wouldn't you run 3 of it? It's a great pull and helps with resonance really nicely. Triple Spinaria, some people run 2, I prefer running 3. Spinaria's value is too good and it gives you the option to discard 1 if you need to. Then I am running the single Hakarabi, just because I was 1 card short in this deck. I originally dropped this one and was trying to find something to fill this slot, and I just couldn't find anything that could work for this deck in particular that I really wanted to run that wasn't just going to clutter me up. So Karabe actually worked really nicely. Being able to put a random artifact from your deck in your hand and then repeat if in resonance. Basically means if you're in resonance you can stay in it while drawing artifacts, and if you aren't in resonance you can basically get into resonance. So those are both good traits. Although the 5-drop is really clunky and awkward to play, especially on curve, it still tends to work out 80% of the time, I would say, which is quite nice as a one-of. I think if you ran 3 it'd be dead too often, but as a one-of, definitely okay. Then of course, triple Otherworld Rift, probably the best card you can run in this deck, with the banish and the fact that you can put a random artifact into your hand, plus the animated one is sweet. Works really well as a setup before Des, if that's what you want to go for. Then of course, Synthetic Beast, your biggest win con. Of course not your only one. You can win the game just purely by board clearing and summoning over and over again till your opponent can't deal with it anymore, which does happen quite regularly. Otherwise, this is basically just your storm damage that you're really focusing on to push out there, although I wouldn't push too hard. If you happen to discard 2 of them, usually you can still be fine, as long as you've got the board presence and you've got the things to back you up. And then Deus Ex Machina, basically I always look at this card as more of a win more card than an actual requirement. Of course, you definitely need it in an artifact deck. There's no doubt that you need it in an artifact deck. It's more so the fact that you can win without Des quite easily if you know what you're doing. This just makes it 100 times easier. So this is pretty much good for the unfavorable matchup. So if you're in an unfavorable matchup to begin with, Des is kind of mandatory. If you get Des in an unfavorable matchup, your matchup now becomes much easier to win. And in the fact of a favorable matchup that you're already going to basically be able to roll and win, this just helps you win quicker and faster, so you don't have any kind of chances to lose too hard, which is nice. A lot of people still think that Des is absolutely mandatory, has to be dropped on sticks, has to do this. Really, it doesn't. Artifacts can work really well even without Des. Des is just extra, is how I've looked at it. Like I said, you don't want to get rid of the card completely, because obviously that would be really bad, but as a win more sort of card, or just a general balance the match out, this works really nicely and can just help you overall just keep flooding the board repeatedly. Although you can do that pretty easily with draw artifacts as well, so it's got a nice mix. You can kind of play in a lot of different playstyles with this deck. You can go into the full ward, you can go into the full draw power, you can go into the full rush, you can mix up a couple of them, mix them all. So many options, just depends on the player and how you want to play this deck and which route you decide to go down. So we'll get right into some games and check it out. So first up, Dragon matchup. The Dragon matchup is usually one that I find Portal has quite a good advantage against, especially tilting Dragon, just because it's much easier for you to swarm the board than it is for them. So you can usually counter their cards a lot better than they can counter yours. And our starting hand for this match was actually pretty much perfect. Des in your opener is ideal, so you definitely want to keep it if you get it, but don't be too worried if you have got a decent 2-drop into 2-drop into 3-drop curve and you don't have Des in your opener, because usually that's a pretty good hand too, and you shouldn't hard mull for Des every single game. Once you learn the matchups, usually then you know when it's right time to hard mulligan for Des and when it's not the right time. So Dragon Oracle, yeah, ramping, pretty normal. Basically, we just want to stick things to the board, so that's why I went for the Hamlin in the early game. That allows the Magisteel Lion to basically get double the value out of itself.
This song's for you.
Meaning, I usually try and put about 6 artifacts into the deck before playing Does. That's usually what I'm aiming for. And Dimensional Cut here is actually going to clean this up really well and allow me to go 4 more damage to their face. This is what you want. In Dragon matchups, being more aggressive is usually okay, especially if they aren't really doing anything other than ramping. If they just purely go for ramp and don't really play much to the board, you can usually secure the early game pretty nicely, which is basically what you're seeing here. So I decide maybe Des is okay next turn. It's just going to come down to what they play. Because we're going to be out of resonance, Des actually has a pretty good line of play here. And with our board being as good as it is, while it can be removed like this, obviously, it's much easier for me to come back from this now because Des can be dropped on an empty board. We're not in resonance, so we get all of the Acceleradium artifact combos, and we can flood more artifacts into our deck, which now Des is on board. We have no concern with putting as many artifacts in the deck as possible. Of course, Sybil, ideal trades. I probably should have just evolved the thing here, but I really wanted to keep it just in case. Plus, we have favorable trade next turn anyway. And Icarus actually makes this a perfect hand. Analyzing Artifact gives us 2 points back, so we get to maximize 7, so we've now spent basically 0 for these 2 cards. And then we can easily set up a nice hand here. We have so many good options, Icarus being probably the best one. Being able to throw Icarus and evolve it will allow us to stay in resonance, which means we can dump the excess cards from this hand that we really don't need, while at the same time being able to flood with these analyzing artifacts and such, which is great. So I do decide to skip out on 1 analyzing here, just so I can go for the Mecha Wing, flood more cards into the deck. It's a little bit better than just trying to draw, especially since we're going to maximize our board space anyway. And we start with a reasonably good hand. Hamlin, Ancient Artifacts, Mecha Wing's okay, Spinaria, all looking really good for turn 8. Of course, Zeus. So the Sakuhil combos coming down. Lucky it wasn't Israfil, that would have been a little harder to deal with. Although I think Israfil just clearing probably wouldn't have been enough anyway, because we would have instantly been able to flood the board again and counter. And reoccurring counters in this deck, once you go like this, it's really easy to do. So I decided to take this out. We get to keep the puppet, which is nice. Flood our deck just that little bit more. Hold on to the Hamlin and Artifact just in case we need to trade again, especially if we see Zeus get dropped here. If Zeus did get dropped here, it's going to be really hard for us to kind of clear it, so that's a good idea when you want to do Hamlin into double H and Artifact. Gets you a nice cool 6 damage, plus 1 from Puppet, and then hopefully just be able to trade whatever else we get. But they do go for Sybil, looking for that healing by the looks. But leaving up 6 damage feels really awkward. I personally would have just thrown the Zeus to the board, just because I feel like that would have been the better option, because now we get the very easy clear with this artifact and the puppet. Although I should have considered Hamlin as an option instead, just because it would have been better to have those come out like that. But we are in Resonance, so thinking about that, I guess being in Resonance anyway, not really going to matter. Should have thrown the Analyzing artifact to the board instead of the Hamlin though. But this hand's perfectly fine. We have the Saphira now, we've got a couple of artifacts in our hand, we've got the Biofab, and a couple of nice solid filler and draw cards.
The engine's busted.
And we have another 4 damage to face if we want it. Really doesn't get much better than this turn. Unfortunately, the Saphira was actually 1 off lethal damage, I think. Which I could have done, I reckon, if I had have actually avoided playing the 2-3. I think it was only 1 off. Just a sec, we'll take a look. Yeah, I think it was only 1 off, so probably a little bit of a mistake to go about that way. I could have went for lethal if I had have done that ordering a little differently, but it all works out when you look at it. I mean, if they have to clear all of this, then that means that anything we play next turn is going to be really solid. Especially since we did draw another beast anyway, which the odds were reasonably high that we would. So, Conflag, obviously countering Daria, that's probably what they're aiming for. Not going to be much use when Saphira is now well and truly above what they have in health.
So broken.
And even if it wasn't Acceleradium and Ancient Artifact, could have boosted it up a little bit.
You're a solid fighter.
Worked out really nicely for that matchup. So next up, we've actually got a really interesting one. Daria Rune versus my Portal deck. So this matchup obviously is quite difficult because Daria can swarm quite hard, and unless Portal gets basically an ideal setup or an ideal playset, it's really hard to deal with Daria. That's why here I decided to focus on the Iron Staff mechanic, clearly, like by keeping that in hand. I'm able to use that to my advantage and ward out a lot of the damage early on and allow me to hopefully trade going forward. Of course, that's not going to be a solution to everything, and considering Portal doesn't have any decent turn 1 play, can make things a little awkward. But our turn 2 is looking reasonably promising. Mecha Wing Swordsman does do its job, shuffling a couple of cards into the deck. One is unfortunately Radiant Artifact, which is good in the late game, bad in the early game. So now we've got to find a way to deal with this. This is where things get a little more interesting. I'm thinking, yeah, the Iron Staff mechanic works really nicely, blocking out both of these attacks pretty well. Even if they use the Ogler to clear this, I'm just going to be easily able to deal with that 2-2 anyway. And the Dimensional Cut next turn and the Icarus is going to be more than enough value to remove most of what's on this board. So, Icarus, really nice. Gives us the draw. We're not worried about being in Resonance now because Ogler is only at 2. And being able to remove things works out quite nicely. So that's what you want. You want to clear out Daria's boards over and over again as much as you can. Of course, that's not going to work all the time, but I found it's the best way to handle Daria when playing Portal, because usually this is a very disadvantaged matchup. So being able to counter Daria is very important, especially when we're only at 10 health here. So we don't see much come out of this. I mean, my only option here is to really evolve and trade, removing the 2-3 from the game.
Now the fight begins.
Mainly because if they evolve the 2-3, it's going to be harder to deal with than this evolved 4-4 already.
How interesting.
And Chimera gets this drop on the board, removing the artifact, which I found quite interesting. I guess they didn't want to handle too many artifacts swarming them out. But for me, that kind of works in my favour. I can drop my Des this turn, basically play it out. I couldn't find a better slot to fit it into, just because if I had have played anything else, the following turns would have been really difficult to throw Des Ex Machina to the board. So now was basically the only chance I had to do it in this kind of matchup. At least unless we went to the really late game, but I really needed to look for some better cards. Which these ones actually aren't too bad at all. Daria does get the drop on the board, but is that really going to be enough? Most likely not. So
It won't be
Ogla,
long now.
Daria, yeah, I'll take all of those.
I'll be swept away. The gears of fate still turn. Weapons
We get the draw on the Machina Soldier, which is great. And the Biofab on the Ancient Artifact, which gives us a great option to trade with Substitution and this artifact while dealing 4 more damage to their face and keeping the Spinaria on the board. Would have been nicer if I had an artifact that could have done this for me, and I reckon if I had thought about it a little more, I probably could have come up with a solution, but this worked out just fine for removing their stuff. And so far, we've kept the board clear basically every major turn. But that's gonna hurt. That piercing, really, really damaging. And even that missile's gonna be even worse. God, no luck, guys. No luck at all for this match. But we have got some options here. I mean, not too bad. We can use the Icarus to both flood the board, or flood the deck, sorry. And with Resonance, we are going to discard our hand, so we're going to have a chance to restock. The only concern now is, can they kill me next turn? If they can't kill me next turn or restock their hand, they're going to be in a really awkward position. And those two cards show me that they really aren't in a great spot, especially when they only have those. Ugh. They need 1 damage, and I'm sure they have quite a few cards that could do it. Now, this is where big amounts of luck are going to come into the game. All I can do now is clear out this board, ward up a bit to avoid any kind of Blade Mage shenanigans, and hope that they don't draw into a spell. Which with 23 cards, the odds of them drawing into a 1 damage spell, not really the best considering we've already seen a couple of them. And next turn for me will be lethal, so this card is important, and it's Magic Owl. Couldn't have asked for a better thing for them to draw. Bricking hard on that turn. Really secured me that game nicely. So this deck goes to show that Portal can hold its own even in the current meta as long as you know what you're doing and you pick your battles properly. Of course there will be some matches where you will just get steamrolled because of RNG, and there isn't much you can do about that. In both Daria matchups and your own matchups, RNG is a huge factor to nearly every single deck. Portal and Daria probably more so just because of how your odds stack up against you for bricking. Although I've found that the way I tend to play Portal, I rarely ever brick. I think I brick 1 in about 10 games, which is pretty reasonable when I consider how often other decks can brick. So, not too bad at all. Hopefully guys enjoyed it. You will find this deck list in the description below. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys next time. See ya.